Artificial intelligence, conflict and climate change lead the agenda at this year's World Economic Forum. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Global business elites and international dignitaries convened in Davos this week for the 54th annual meeting of the World Economic Forum. This year's theme is Rebuilding Trust as the world faces raging conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Delegates are also addressing the threats posed by artificial intelligence and the ongoing climate crisis. Chinese Premier Liang gave a speech focusing on these very issues. CGTN's Evangelos Sipsas has this report.
Artificial intelligence, business opportunities with China, and stronger than expected economic growth. Just some of the topics Chinese Premier Liang touched on in his speech before global business and political leaders at the World Economic Forum in Davos. He said the doors are expected to be even wider open for foreign investment.
这些年，我们对世界经济增长贡献率
China's contribution to global economic growth has remained at around 30%. Last year, the Chinese economy rebounded with an estimated growth of around 5.2%, beating the 5% target set at the beginning of the year.
GDP 的增幅在5.2%左右。
Li also touched upon the much-anticipated theme, artificial intelligence. He compared it to a double-edged sword. On the one hand, he said it could close the gap between high and low-income economies and boost opportunity, but he warned it could bring more division. He called for more governance.
中国人
China believes that technology must serve the common good of humanity. The same applies to artificial intelligence. It must be people-centered. Human beings must control the machines. AI must be guided in a direction that is conducive to the progress of humanity. So there should be a red line in AI development, a red line that mustn't be crossed.
This is the most high-profile Chinese delegation to attend Davos since 2017, and it was much anticipated by the decision makers and the global economy shapers, many of whom were there at the speech, a speech that they seemed to like.
The Premier said is absolutely on point. I mean, if you think about pharmaceutical supply chain, it really is global in nature, right? If you think back about past couple of years with the pandemic and the disruption within the global supply chain, it demonstrates more that we really need that globalization, that smoothing out of supply chain, as he mentioned.
Evangelos Sipsas for CGTN from Davos.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Oregon, Liang is Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. In Brasilia, Gustavo Ribeiro is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. From New York, we're joined by Anthony Chan. He is a former chief economist at JPMorgan Chase & Company. And from Davos, we're joined by Philippe Monnier. He is an international business executive. Welcome to all of you to the show. Philippe, let me start with you. In Davos, the theme for this year's forum is Rebuilding Trust. Now, Klaus Schwab, who is the founder of the forum, said that to restore trust, there needs to be open, transparent conversations. What is he referring to when he talks about that? I mean, what is this gathering hoping to achieve?
You know, I think the very fact that people are meeting is very positive. I think there is only the World Economic Forum, which has the convening power to attract business leaders, to attract the top politicians, religious leaders, the young generation, on the simple fact of meeting face-to-face during 1 week, to have informal conversation from very early in the morning until very late in the evening. I think this is what I would call, on what probably Professor Schwab calls rebuilding trust, having those face-to-face meetings in a very specific setting, which is the mountain of Switzerland.
Right, Philippe, as you say, this is a gathering that is able to attract very high-profile guests, politicians, business people, other dignitaries as well. And you've had a lot of experience of this. Do you see a forum like this, the World Economic Forum, as an effective agent of change?
I think it is certainly effective. It is not, I would say, the only step. It is a very important first step, which is followed up by many other steps. And many other steps are actually conducted by the World Economic Forum, because the World Economic Forum is not only organizing those high-level meetings, they're also creating a lot of high-value content together with a lot of partners. They are running communities, they are running very concrete pilot projects. So I think, yes, I would say it is a very effective organization.
Yan Liang, as we saw in our report, the Chinese Premier Li Qiang, he also addressed the forum in Davos. He introduced a 5-point plan, which included macroeconomic policy coordination, industrialization coordination, innovation, green development, and North-South and South-South cooperation. I mean, how big is a challenge that today, when we see so much of the world is polarized, and it's polarized along North-South lines, East-West lines, and we see it, getting more, the gap getting wider and wider?
Right, good to talk to you, Anand. I think it's very important that Premier Li Qiang did mention all these 5 areas of cooperation. And I think even, he didn't mention specifically any countries, but it's very clear that we're seeing very divergent, both in terms of understanding of where the world is heading, but also in actual, actions. For instance, he talked about the cooperation in science and technology and talk about utilizing AI for the common goods. But we see, countries like the United States has been waging on the de-risking campaign, which is basically, trying to ban some of the high-tech assets, from China, from China's access to these high tech, and also in a way sort of trying to really confine, some of the technology developments in their own sort of block. And we are also hearing this idea that we need to cooperate in supply chain, which again, the de-risking strategy is the opposite of that. So I think you're right. There's a lot of contentions and different ideas. And so I think it's very important to really point out that the shared vision of the humanity is what really the basis for building the trust. And unfortunately, I think with all the geopolitical tensions and conflict, and with this idea, which is very misguided thinking, that escalation for de-escalation, I think that is really an oxymoron. So unfortunately, I think we're going to see things getting worse before we'll see a better outcome. But that said, I think really what Premier Li is really doing a great job here is really to show that China's position and also China's sort of leadership in really trying to find the common path towards building trust.
Gustavo, we also saw some key officials from Latin America attending the World Economic Forum, including the recently elected Argentine president, Javier Milei. He has been called all kinds of things. He's been called a populist, he's been called a right-wing extremist, and he's made it clear that he is no fan of socialism. His address was titled Freedom to Transact. How was it received?
Well, I mean, as Davos speeches go, it was kind of something what Javier Milei said. He said that capitalism is fair and morally superior to socialism, and that it's the only thing responsible for expanding wealth in the world. And I mean, defending capitalism and attacking socialism in a forum full of billionaires, it's certainly he's catering to the audience. But I mean, the reality is that Milei is going to have a hard time implementing his agenda in Congress. He has a package of sweeping reforms to deregulate the Argentine economy. I mean, on his side is the fact that after decades of interventionism and crony capitalism that put Argentina in an economic convulsion. But I mean, Argentina is not the liberal, the free market oasis that he says he wants to implement. It's a country with 200% inflation. And I mean, many of his reforms must stand the test of Congress and legal challenges. So, I mean, as much as many economic agents have received well Millei's first 6-7 weeks in office. Bank of America even published a report calling it a promising start. It remains to be seen if he will deliver on his promises.
Anthony, the United States delegation included many national security officials, very high-level officials. There was the Secretary of State there, Anthony Blinken. There was the National Security Advisor, Jake Blinken. He was there as well. Blinken did focus on more money for Israel and for Ukraine in his address to the forum. What does that tell us? Is national security now the priority in the United States?
Well, in the United States, given the polarization that you've mentioned a few minutes ago that's taking place in the United States, I realize it's happening in other parts of the world, but that polarization is preventing the United States from honoring the commitment to help its allies. And of course, what Blinken wants to do is to really hammer in the national security risk that we have as he speaks not only to the rest of the world, but he's also speaking to the audience in Congress to ensure that somehow those aid packages get passed and the United States will be able to honor its promises, or some might say commitments, because at the same time, if the U.S. doesn't, then it also sends a strong message to Europe as to why should they bear the entire burden on their own. So yes, he was speaking to many audiences, but national security is top of mind in the United States right now.
Right, and Anthony, on economic issues, I mean, we heard that speech from the Chinese Premier Liang. He talked about macroeconomic policy coordination, industrialization, innovation, green development. What were your thoughts on that?
Well, I was very encouraged because if you go back a year ago or even more recently, both sides were not talking in such friendly terms. Now, I do realize that because you hear the talk doesn't mean that becomes reality. But I think it's encouraging to hear that talk. And I hope that the United States eventually will hear those words and take them to heart. And they will start speaking the same language. And before you know it, they get a little bit closer to each other as the process goes. That was not the case a year ago. So I'm encouraged we're moving in the right direction. But there's still a long ways to go between what you say and what you actually do.
Philippe, at a time like this when we see a great deal of instability in many parts of the world, what is your assessment of what's going on in Europe right now in terms of its economy, growth in Europe, stability, economic stability in Europe?
You know, there are a lot of economists who are very good at making very detailed analysis. As a business person, I prefer to talk to the other business people and to share our opinion based on our sentiment. It is also important because we don't run countries, we run companies, and eventually we decide whether we decide to invest or not in the future. So overall, I would say the sentiment is not very good now because a lot of people are concerned about all those natural disasters, about the conflict in Ukraine, the conflict in Gaza, which may sort of expand. And inflation is still relatively high, as well as unemployment. So I would say the sentiment is not very positive, but of course it depends very much from industry to industry, and I would also say from country to country.
Right, Philippe, you talk about inflation, you talk about unemployment, and of course the conflicts that are taking place in Ukraine as well as in Gaza. And we also know that the United States, for instance, is having a difficult time getting more money from Congress for Israel, for Ukraine as well. But the EU president, Ursula von der Leyen, said that EU nations will come up with 50 billion euros for Ukraine. It'll be over the next 4 years. How does Europe come up with that kind of money when it's facing these really powerful economic headwinds?
You know that I'm not so sure that it will be followed up by action because there are still some additional steps before the investment can be made in supporting Ukraine. And then one thing is to make a statement or sort of to express a wish in a forum. And another thing is to actually convince your member countries to actually send the money.
Liang, here's something that's really interesting. The forum also published a survey of 60+ chief economists on economic priorities. Now, that's something that the forum does every time it meets. But this year, 56% of them expect a global economic downturn. China and the United States will see moderate to strong growth, but Europe will see weak to very weak growth. What are your thoughts on that survey?
Right. I think that survey also echoes with the forecast of institutions like the IMF, World Bank. They all forecasted slower growth in 2024 than 2023. So I think that is a pretty much shared kind of sentiment that the U.S. growth is probably going to be okay with the very large fiscal stimulus and also the potential rate cuts in this year. And for China, I think the recent data that show, for example, 2023 grew at 5.2%, and then with the ongoing, fiscal support and also the structural transformation and the stabilization of the real estate market, China probably will continue to grow, at 4.5%-ish. But yes, Europe, I think the European economy is really in trouble. So I think inflation is still is not abated as much as they would like to see. And also the governments like in Germany are really on the path of, I would say, ultra conservative, very austerity kinds of programs, cutting spendings on, climate change actions, and not upgrading their infrastructures and not investing enough in their education and so on and so forth. So we see this year Germany's economy has contracted. And as the leader of the European economy, that is not a sign, and that does not bode well for the entire European economy. So I think 2024 may see a tough year for Europe. That said, I think there's still chance if the governments put their acts together, they could still have a chance to try to stabilize the economy and expand. And also, I think developing countries probably will have a little bit of breathing room if the Fed and ECB start to cut rates early and in an aggressive manner. But I don't think that's necessarily as certain as some would expect, given all these global economic uncertainties and risks.
Anthony, given that many countries have been able to cope with inflation, and if we look at the economic growth numbers, the forecast numbers for China and for the United States, the two biggest economies, as the Premier pointed out, China has done better than forecast, just over 5%, 5.2%. Growth, we had growth in the United States as well. And global growth is expected to be around 3%. Are you surprised by the gloomy predictions that were cited in this survey?
No, not really, because what you're seeing is the fact that all countries around the world have had, to some extent, some inflation. Obviously, China's the exception. But as they deal with inflation, they have to think about becoming easier on monetary policy, but not so quickly. And that's the problem that Europe is having. And that's why Europe is perhaps the weakest link in the global economy, because their inflation is coming down, but not coming down quick enough. And so they may not be able to lower interest rates quick enough. And if they're not really pursuing very expansionary fiscal policy and not lowering rates aggressively, that is a formula for sluggish economic growth. In the United States, we have all these stimulus programs, whether it be the Inflation Reduction Act or the CHIPS Act. Those things are going to add some stimulus. And of course, the central bank has already vowed to lower rates, even though the rates may not go down as rapidly or as great as some market participants would like, but they are going to move in that direction. So that's why you have tailwinds in the United States, and you're not going to have those tailwinds in other parts of the world chipping in. So that, I think, explains. But 3% global economic growth is not bad, because remember, as long as global economic growth is higher than 2.5%, for the most part, it is not such a bad scenario for the world.
Gustavo, I want to turn now to another issue that was discussed at the forum, and that is climate change and environmental protection. And I want to refer you to something that was said by Brazil's Supreme Court Chief Justice Luis Roberto Barroso, who told reporters, and he did this on the sidelines of the forum, he said that Brazil risks losing sovereignty over the Amazon to organized crime. I mean, that's pretty alarming when one considers how important the Amazon rainforest is to climate change, to environmental protection. What can you tell us about this warning?
Yes, it's pretty alarming. The Amazon is a huge area in Brazil, and it's not densely populated. The presence of the state is very feeble there. Brazil has a lot of trouble controlling its frontiers. I mean, all of its frontiers, but especially in the Amazon. And I mean, the Amazon has become one of the main corridors for drug trafficking in Brazil. It's what we call the quote-unquote Solimões route, which has been heavily exploited by drug gangs that bring cocaine into Brazil from Peru through the upper portion of the Amazon River, which is known in that portion as the Solimões River. Drugs are then sent to Manaus, which is the biggest city in the Amazon, and go to other parts of the country and Europe. And I mean, drug trafficking in the Amazon has reached such levels that in 2015, the police in one of the Brazilian Amazon states found a 17-meter submarine that was believed to be used by gangs to transport drugs. So we are seeing also timber exploitation, illegal mining running amok, and that got worse during the Jair Bolsonaro years because he had a 100% hands-off approach to the environmental issue, and now the government is trying to reclaim these areas and have a more effective control there, but I mean, it's trying to recover from institutions that had been cut down to the bone.
Philippe, earlier this month, the World Economic Forum released its Global Risks Report for 2024, and here are the top 5 risks as they put it down. It is mis- and disinformation being the #1 risk, followed by extreme weather, societal polarization, cybersecurity, and armed conflict. What are your thoughts on these risks that are outlined there by the forum and how detrimental they can be?
I think that all those risks are extremely serious and can be very detrimental. And it is very important to take all possible measures. And I think that there is a very, I would say, a strong agreement among the participants that those are the risks which are very serious, and maybe some of them are relatively new, like misinformation or cybersecurity risk.
Anthony, what are your thoughts on this risk assessment that was published by the forum?
Well, it is very troubling because this misinformation and disinformation, given the fact that close to half or more of the entire world are going to have elections in 2024, if you have this as a real risk, it really tells you that we can really encounter some real challenges in terms of fair elections or in managing these elections if the world is going to be full of this disinformation and misinformation trend that is up there in the list that the World Economic Forum put out. So that's why I think it's so serious. And of course, managing business in a world where cybersecurity is not only getting bolder but getting more aggressive is also going to be a serious situation. And I am very concerned with all the geopolitical conflicts that are going on, whether you look at the Red Sea, whether you look at the Black Sea, or whether you look at other parts of the world, the Panama and Canal, because of climate issues is having challenges. So all those things really tell me that the global supply chain is at risk. And that, of course, means that there are going to be some inflationary pressures associated with that, which can have serious implications for how monetary policy is handled and therefore how quickly inflation comes down.
Liang, another big concern for companies is the proliferation of AI, artificial intelligence. Let's listen to Carolina Clint. She was speaking at the forum. She is from the business services company Marsh McLennan. Let's watch.
In my conversations with the companies, 2 issues consistently come up as current key concerns. And it's the impact of artificial intelligence, and it is supply chain challenges. That's what companies are concerned about right now. And these are also notable risks highlighted in this year's Global Risks Report.
So Liang, what do you make of those concerns that she talked about? And there's one other concern, and that is the IMF also predicts that 40% of jobs will be impacted, they say, by AI. So where are we heading?
Right, that's an excellent question. And I think that also goes back to the risk factor. The first one, misinformation, disinformation, that has a lot to do with AI-generated information. So I think all these are links. These are linked. These risks are all linked. So I think that also, goes back to what Premier Li Qiang mentioned, which was also echoed by the IMF director and also the General Secretary of the United Nations. And they're basically sounding the alarm that, on the one hand, yes, AI could have great potential to boost productivity and bring more, sort of equal growth opportunities for countries and for different walks of people. But at the same time, AI needs to be governed, and it also needs to make sure that the AI generates the shared benefits among all humanities instead of only, benefiting certain groups of people and certain special interests. So I think that is very clear that these kinds of understanding, it's important to really guide the AI development. So, the business community is, of course, very, very excited about, what AI can do and what profitable, this technology is going to be. But at the same time, I think we really need to be sober about, how to govern AI, how to make sure that AI really works to boost the productivity and bring the benefits, and also being shared instead of, being used, as Premier Li talked about, as camp-based division or confrontation. So I think it's very balanced, like what Premier Li said. This is a double-edged sword.
Gustavo, I've got a minute left, but I just want to look at the question of global equality, or global inequality, to be more accurate. This is what Amitabh Bihar of the NGO Oxfam told the forum. Let's listen.
I would say it's, again, devastating. It tells us that now we are entering a decade of division, where 5 top billionaires have doubled their wealth, but on the other hand, 5 billion people collectively have become poorer. And Oxfam is estimating that within just a decade, we'll have a trillionaire amongst us. But on the other hand, it'll take more than 200 years to end poverty.
So, Gustavo, that's not very hopeful, is it? And we didn't hear much about closing that gap on global inequality.
No, it's not very hopeful. And I mean, to take my grain of salt about talking about Latin America, for instance, we have seen that in Brazil, the 15,000 richest people have grown their wealth way faster than the rest. And we still...
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you there. We have run out of time, Gustavo. Thank you to everyone for being on the show. We have to leave it there. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.